in this case, the constitutional duty of businesses to shape the constitutional order such that it provides a flourishing economy, because that's what a flourishing society needs. Independence means making that responsibility your own, having an internal locus of control, and not abdicating that to a government.
South Africa is undergoing a fundamental political realignment. What role will business play in pushing for reform and changes to our political economy? Well, this is a question that I often pose to my guests on this show, Solutions with David Ansara, and some of the answers are very interesting. I thought in this special episode of the Solutions podcast, I would look back on a selection of these conversations to pick out the strategies as well as the principles that should guide business in this time of transition and change. If you're curious to listen to the original episodes that these extracts were taken from, I'd encourage you to check out the links in the description below. Well, let's get into it.
I wanted to start the conversation just by talking about business advocacy. And it seems to me that the last 4 years or so have been characterized by this idea of consensus seeking, social compacting. The president has been a champion of that. But yet we see a number of hostile laws continuing to be promulgated on the statute books. So Piet, may I start with you? Why do you think this kind of traditional understanding of business advocacy has failed? And what could be an alternative to it?
Well, David, I can take it even a little bit further back. If we look at the history of the past few hundred years, the state as we know it and its development, there was one of the things that stand out from statecraft is the idea that the state is responsible for maintaining a healthy economic environment, a healthy environment for business. And often we would hear the people legitimize the interventions of state laws and so on by saying, well, that's the legitimate role of government. So even in a minimal view of government, people still say that's the role of the state to create a good environment for business. But at Sakliga, we say maybe that's not entirely correct. Maybe the responsibility should in the first instance lie with business itself. And certainly in South Africa, we've come to a point where abdicating the responsibility for a favorable environment for business to the state is imprudent. It is even, I would say, irresponsible. And we have come to a point where the obvious failures of the approach of lobbying, asking government more nicely and more urgently to do things differently next time, or even right now, just doesn't work. It's not enough to simply ask government. It's not enough to simply present better policies for government to adopt. We need to come to a point where we, instead of lobby for change, negotiate for change. And that's an important mind shift. And at Sakliga, we certainly say that's what businesses should do. They should internalize the responsibility for creating a favorable environment and see the state as one of the important entities that should be engaged on this, but not ask the state to take that responsibility more seriously. Just say, become more strong as businesses, organize, and come to a point where we can negotiate with the state to say, this is not acceptable, we're not going to do B in this way, etc. And I think that's the point where we are now. We've seen a failure of asking the government more nicely. We need to come to a point of insisting more firmly.
Now, Russell, Neil Froneman, the CEO of Sibanye-Stillwater, the mining company, has said that we need to abandon the consensus-seeking approach and move more towards a transactional approach, similar to what Peter's just said. Why do you think business is so inclined towards this kind of social partnership kind of model? Why have they gone along with this? And how do we begin to kind of nudge business towards this more transactional approach?
This is a great line of questioning, and I'm quite encouraged that people are coming to this realization from different perspectives and from different angles. It's not like we're all getting into a room and coming up with this idea. So that excites me because it shows that there's sort of a bit of a dawning of perception on this thing. It's intuitively appealing that to create social order, you must agree on everything. Okay. The problem is that humans and groups and various different interest groups and so on have such divergent views of the world. This is what a plurality and pluralism is all about. We have very different views of the world, different ideas on how to get where we're going. So, some of us have different destinations. To the extent that we have the same destinations, different means and methods of getting there. And I think when you try and build consensus and create, social compacts and so on, you end up focusing only on what you can agree on. And very often that's actually very little. So you often only make progress or cooperation on quite trivial matters, and you leave unspoken about the things that you really disagree on, which very often is very substantive. And that ends up festering in the background and doesn't actually get dealt with and creates tremendous amount of grievance. And I think we've got to move now towards a much more mature method of engagement, which is the idea of making demands, reciprocity, so hearing the other side's demands, figuring out how to react to those demands, and essentially negotiating a particular position. What you've called a more perhaps transactional approach. Far more mature, far more realistic in a society of divergent interests. So it's really encouraging that seems to be where some thinking is heading now. And we certainly are beginning to see quite clearly that understands the creation of social order in a far deeper and more mature way than pretending that we agree on everything.
I think this kind of goes back to one of your other talking points, Songezo, which is that many people in the professional class seem to be a bit disengaged from politics and kind of social activism. Why do you think that is? And how can we start to stir them out of their slumber?
I think there are three reasons in the main, and I'll say them quickly. The first one is that we've never really had democratization as a project. We had freedom, political freedom as a project, but not democratization, which is where a lot more people feel a greater sense of responsibility for the republic and what happens to it. So that's one of the reasons we formed Rivonia Circle, because that's what we want to provoke. The second reason is that people get terribly intimidated, and I think I can surmise that a lot of people who will watch this are in companies. They know how companies get intimidated the moment they say something that is even remotely honest. What tends to happen is that the companies themselves don't like their employees speaking out as citizens. So there has been an inadvertent collaboration between the ANC and its sensitivities as the governing party and the complicity of companies and other employers, which have had that chilling effect on people and made them not to speak. That's the second thing. The last one is because of the first two, a lot of people think that politics is something that comes with a special anointing. It's not. When you have a sense of national duty, it becomes your responsibility to find like-minded people in a democracy to make sure that the idea that we have prevails. And I think that sense is not there. Now, how do we get them back into action? We use this crisis, David. I think the people that have always been able to buy their way out of the incapacities of the state can't anymore, because there's no electricity, there's no water, and so you can't run away. The question is, what do you do with that crisis? I think this is ripe for organizing. This is ripe for the production of innovative ideas, and even taking existing ideas and using them as political issues going forward. And lastly, this is the right time for fresh leadership, because survey after survey that we do at Rivonia Circle, people want new, more energetic leadership. And therefore, there is an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think it speaks also to the broad role of business in society collectively. If you think of organized business, particularly big business, and you were inside the belly of the beast for a number of years there. And, I think that this lack of confidence, this equivocation, I think often plays into the ANC government's hands, that basically a policy like expropriation without compensation gets put on the table. business says, okay, well, let's deal with this constructively and engage with government. Maybe you end up with a watered down version of NHI or EWC or prescribed assets. But ultimately what happens there is you end up reinforcing the ideological agenda of the government, which is inimical to growth and development. And so I've argued on this show and other platforms that business maybe needs to move away from the consensus-seeking approach with government and take on more of a transactional approach to negotiate on policy rather than just to reinforce and reproduce the government's agenda. What do you say to that?
Actually, business needs to be bolder. So the problem with the business sector is that it feels that it needs to stay out of politics. And so there are very few companies that fund political parties and fund political campaigns. It is up to the private family wealth philanthropies to fund civil society, because businesses are being politically correct and not wanting to fund organizations that agitate. And yet it is those organizations that have hit the streets, protested, and made sure that Zuma does not do as much damage as it did. And so there is a need for a change in orientation in business as part of that democratization project that I was talking about, because in other countries, businesses fund political ideas they agree with. And it's time that business takes that fundamental step, because otherwise you have this vacuum where business wants to be in the good graces of people who are misgoverning. And because of that, they are failing to support initiatives that are going to make things better. It doesn't work. The whole consensus building mechanism between the national government and business is premised on national stakeholder relationships, which sometimes are incestuous for various reasons, because there's cross-pollination between the party and certain board members and that sort of thing. It is under these circumstances, David, that now local government has collapsed because nobody has been paying attention to it. Nobody has been paying attention to it. Yet every business in this economy is in a locality. Now, I'll give you a very quick example about any courier company out there. With load shedding, it means they don't make their delivery targets per day. Facing their margins are being further squeezed by high energy costs, by diesel, and the roads are terrible. And so they pay more for breakdowns and that sort of thing. I'm sure those margins are close to zero or negative margins. That's how, out of a lack of understanding of where the political failures is, you start killing the economy. And I'm sorry, therefore, in this context, business has been complicit in the destruction of the economy. It's the political correctness, it's a lack of understanding of how to drive democratic accountability so that the voice of business is not isolated as it has been now. And often people feel that they shouldn't speak because they don't have the legitimacy. The legitimacy is earned by supporting initiatives that people can see fight for their cause too, beyond charity, signing a check and giving it to the Solidarity Fund.
Yeah, I think CSI initiatives are a way for business to kind of provide cover for themselves and say, oh, look, we're doing our part by painting the fence at a primary school or something. But they're very meek when it comes to dealing with bad policy. I mean, I am encouraged to see the likes of Fani Titi, the CEO of Investec, Gareth Ackerman, the chairman of Pick and Pay, starting to raise some criticisms. I would say it's still rather timid at the moment. But, you know, I think the kind of robust criticism that we see, for example, from the Sibanye Stillwater CEO, Neil Froneman, I think is part of how you achieve results. And I think this idea of business leaders, real leaders make difficult calls and aren't afraid necessarily to alienate others. I think it doesn't mean that you must be aggressive, but you can be firm about defending your interests and the broader needs of the economy.
Now, I'm going to push you there, David. The ANC has known that no matter how frankly government speaks, ultimately they want to hurt them politically. It comes down to that. It's like any market, and politics is a market. If ultimately somebody is not going to hurt your bottom line in any way whatsoever, why would you pay attention to them? You don't. That's business's problem. And that's the difference between business in South Africa and business in more mature democracies. So I insist on this. It doesn't always have to be political parties that they fund, but the reason business becomes isolated and gets ignored by the people is because as somebody who sits on boards of philanthropies, I know, David, that were it not for those often overseas philanthropies, there would be no civil society in South Africa because business is trying to be politically correct. It can't continue anymore. And the reason a lot more people are beginning to speak up as timidly as possible is because that conspiracy of silence has brought us where we are now. And they are still afraid. And they should not be afraid because in a democracy, fear produces dictatorship.
Well, look, it's not a very positive story about the state of the mining sector in South Africa, but what can people who have an interest in this industry, who might be working in the industry or downstream, what can they do in their individual capacity to try and preserve the incredible value that exists there and to see growth of the industry in the future? Is it being a bit more outspoken about nefarious government policy?
Go it alone. Create your own power, generate your own power. Unfortunately, have your own security. You've got to go it alone until the state comes right. And I believe this is a discussion on the mining industry, but I believe that we're going to be in that position until the ANC disappears and is replaced with something that is pro-democracy and that is pro the interest of the country. And until that time, the mining industry has to go it alone, as I said, generate its own power, have its own security, because you're not going to get help from the state to do it. That is the reality.
Yeah, I suppose going alone could also mean working with others in a like-minded way, not necessarily working in isolation per se.
Correct. I mean, if you look at the mining company, let's look at Pan-African Resources. They listed gold mining company. They've got operations in Barberton. They very recently switched on their big power, their solar power generating system to help them with power. Other mining companies are doing the same. Of course, our government is 2 or 3 years behind the power curve in allowing people to do that, the regulatory environment to do that. But there's still issues with that power generation. My view is, if you want to save South Africa, privatize everything. Privatize everything. Wrest the economy out of the hands of the government, and we'll make progress.
So per our earlier discussion, do you think that business should be actively working against the government in that sense? So being a bit more outspoken about perhaps supporting the opposition or working, to draw much kind of harder, clearer lines to say, you cannot
Correct.
go beyond this point.
You can't go beyond this point. And do not allow the government to overstep the mark of governance and to do sort of administrative overreach. Just stop them legally, and just refuse to cooperate in that circumstance. People have got to take a hard line with the government. We've got a failed state we're dealing with. The only way we're going to fix that mess is if we are harder with the government who's letting us down every single day.
Yeah, and I think for valid reasons, business has often been a bit coy to engage in politics because they say, well, the business of business is business and we just don't want to get involved. But actually what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is, well, if you're naive about politics, that ends up actually infiltrating your commercial interests, strangling your ability to actually do business. I think business people should be thinking more about, well, which constituency do they serve? Whose interests do they serve? We talk a lot about business leaders, but leaders are prepared to make tough calls, hard decisions, and to stand up for the people that they represent. It's not just a popularity contest. It's actually about making those difficult decisions. And sometimes that means engaging in fights.
Correct. David, if you want to fix South Africa, if you told me you've got one thing to say to me to fix South Africa, not a whole thesis or a whole plan, just one thing. And it's simple. And that's the mining industry in South Africa. Fix the South African Police Services and National Prosecuting Authority. Fix it. Create an environment where there are consequences for criminals, where there are consequences for corrupt officials in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, where people go to jail.
But do you think that organized business has been forceful enough in putting forward an alternative policy agenda, in criticizing hostile policies that create this inhibiting business environment that we're seeing?
I would say yes and no. I think that the problem with business is that it needs to take its political blinkers off, if I can put it that way. What I mean by that is that business in this country is very reluctant to enter the political terrain. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that every time they've done it in the past, they have been castigated. Going back to the days of Tony Treyer, over 20 years ago, when he said that South Africa, has political risk attached to it when he was releasing the annual report of Anglo American, and Thabo Mbeki, ripped it to shreds. So there's been a general reluctance on the part of business to engage critically with government. That's not to say that they haven't put forward policies. They do regularly. In fact, when after COVID, they put a very, very comprehensive economic policy document together under BS4, B for South Africa, Business for South Africa, which is a newly formed organization combining BLSA with the Black Business Council. And yet the government has ignored it largely. So, when I first went into Parliament in 2014, in the very first committee meeting, I was the Shadow Minister for Small Business Development. I raised the issue with the minister, Lindiwe Zulu at the time, of the trust deficit. And she wasn't even aware that there was such a thing. She was so divorced from the business environment that she just denied that there was such a thing as a trust deficit. So there was a huge gap between business and government, which is supposed to have been closed in institutions like NEDLAC. But unfortunately, it just hasn't been the case. So a business needs to try harder. I know that people like Neil Froneman from Sibanye-Stillwater has made an attempt. He may be a little bit aggressive on occasions, but business needs to be more forceful in explaining, the critical problems that we face, which are not just economic, they are political. And yet, as I said, most business people are either reluctant or incapable of entering the political terrain on any level of sophistication.
Yeah, I posed a similar question to Songezo Zibi in a recent episode of this podcast, and he said, well, listen, government is only really going to respond if they feel some kind of political pressure to do so, if they feel that there's something to be lost by not engaging. And perhaps what I would suggest is that business needs to understand that it has institutional power and that can be exercised for leverage. And that doesn't mean that you must be needlessly aggressive. It must just be about having a firm stance and saying, well, these are our interests. These are the constituents that we represent, consumers, our employees, our shareholders, and this is what we want. This policy should not be accepted. I'm thinking EWC, NHI, etc.
I would go further than that, David, and I would say that business is very reluctant to get off the fence in terms of party political affiliation. And if you think of other mature democracies, whether it be America, Britain, Germany, France, you'll see that business essentially is very outspoken in terms of the political positioning that they take. And unfortunately, that's not the case in this country. There's been a stitch-up between big business and the ANC, and big business has been very reluctant to be critical of the ANC and say, look, we need new political formations or stronger opposition that can not just become opposition or remain as opposition, but can compete as potential governing parties, which means being prepared to say, I support this party or that party, but not the ANC.
Yeah, I'd imagine that many of these businesses have lucrative contracts with the state, or they benefit from regulatory protection. or they have deployed cadres on their boards who try to influence the agenda and decision-making in favor of government.
And that has been one of the winning strategies of the ANC since it became the government in 1994, is that through cadre deployment, they have infiltrated every walk of life, and that includes business. And one of the things that business did in the 1994 settlement was to ingratiate itself with the ANC through the adoption of what became BEE policy, and the transfer of ownership portions of their companies to well-connected ANC cadres.
Yeah, and of course, this policy is dressed up in the language of transformation, empowering Black people. But actually, as we opened this conversation, many millions of Black people are on the margins of the economy. It's only a very small, politically connected elite that really benefits. And any criticism of that is dismissed as racist or anti-transformation.
Yes, I think one of the reasons for this is that if you go back to the 1994 settlement, and this is quite well described by Sibisi Jonas in his book After Dawn, published a couple of years ago, he described the four main groupings that negotiated that settlement. And they were, in his words, the established elite, the new elite, essentially the former being big businesses, the latter being the ANC. Then there was organized labor, and then there was the unemployed and the poor. And the one important class that was not part of this negotiated settlement was the entrepreneurial class, by which I mean the hundreds of thousands of small businesses that relied upon a growing economy and competitive economy and deregulation to enable them to grow. And essentially that resulted in the economy missing out on huge potential that really has been with us ever since. And I think that the ability of government, labor, and big business to essentially to stitch up the economy has been a major constraint on growth, and that is something which most commentators have failed to observe, let alone failed to speak out on. I think it's beginning to change, but when you have someone like Sipho Nkosi, who's the red tape czar that was appointed by President Ramaphosa, hardly even appearing at all. I mean, I don't think anybody's seen him in, on the TV or in any media. You actually wonder, well, is the government serious about improving the lot of the small business owner in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think an appointment like that is optics. He's obviously a very capable man, but he's operating within an institutional setting that is actively going to be working against him. And you think of this idea of red tape, that it's just this emergent thing that somehow is there, and you just need to cut it, and that will free up business. But no, it's the constraining policies are the consequence of the ideological convictions of the party. It's a feature, not a bug of the system. So until you fix the underlying fundamentals of the policy framework, you're not really going to get rid of things like red tape.
Yeah. And I think an added problem, David, here is that we have to face up to the fact that because government departments in all three spheres of government and state-owned enterprises have now been run, if I can use that term, although they're not being run very well, by hundreds of thousands of deployed cadres, it's going to take a long, long time to remove those people. So even if we wanted to suddenly remove the red tape and improve the regulatory environment, it's going to take an awful long time because the people that have put it all in place are still there. So we either have to change their approach and mindsets, which is going to be difficult, or we have to go through a process of extracting them. You see the problem happening in for example, the city of Johannesburg or Tshwane, where the turnaround time is more than one term of government, more than 5 years, because you have to actually have the right people in place to make those changes. It took the DA at least 5 years since they won Cape Town to actually achieve that. And only after 1 or 2 terms were they able to deliver the results.
And what about business, Jonathan? I mean, because in many ways we're starting to see business coming out of hibernation a little bit. We saw that very high profile clash between Busi Mavuso of Business Leadership South Africa in that Scopa parliamentary committee, saying that Eskom shouldn't be blamed for the misgovernance by the ANC. We've seen some chief executives, Fani Titi from Investec, and others kind of complaining. I think Gareth Ackerman as well, complaining about the poor state of services. But some of it is kind of a bit timid as far as I can see. Do you think that business will be able to find its voice and push more assertively for growth enhancing market friendly policies?
I think Busi Mavusa is marvelous. Nothing holds her back. She gives credit where credit is due, but she's been fiercely critical and is not scared of anything. She reports to her constituency, which is big business. But I think in certain respects, she is ahead of them in her criticism of the party. Yes, a few months ago, one had in the space of a week, a number of big corporate bosses come out and say, the ANC has to reform. Gareth Ackerman comes out and says, our trucks can't get into certain areas because of the poor state of roads and the risk that they will be hijacked. Then the bosses of Richard Wainwright and Fani Titi at Investec came out and criticized government for not doing enough on general reform and service delivery and so forth. And the bosses at Standard Bank came out with complaining about certain issues. That's a change, and I think a significant change, because government has been very cautious. And now President Ramaphosa wants to sign a social compact with big business, and that would involve big business, labor, government, and community. And there have been delays on this. He wanted to do this some months ago with 100 days. I don't know whether the 100 days are up. But, what is, if a social compact, by definition, would involve trades between the various parties. So business would want reform on some of the big issues which we've discussed. Probably labor market reform ultimately, although big business very often doesn't want labor market reform, but they've probably seen the necessity of this economic growth. But what does government want? But would government give the sort of reforms that business want, making it easier to employ people, getting rid of red tape? I think that those would be, we're not privy to the negotiations, but these would be the sort of issues that might come up. And what is Labour going to give? Are they going to agree to wage moderation or at below the inflation rate or at the inflation rate? What's in it for business if the other parties don't give way? And I would think that the others are not giving way. Yeah, business, what they probably want out of business is a commitment to greater investment. Well, is that good for the shareholders? And big business has to ultimately is ultimately responsible to its shareholders, and is not going to invest as much as it would in circumstances where there's substantial risks that are not being addressed.
And in many respects, the business sector is filling the void left by the retreating state. So if you just look at the mining industry, for example, many of these impoverished communities around the major mines are being supported by the mining companies in terms of social services, etc. There are many private organizations, basically filling those state functions, those traditional state functions. But, I think to your point, we're not going to social compact our way out of this crisis. We need pretty significant trade-offs. And this whole notion of social compacting assumes that you can make everyone happy. But I think there have to be winners and losers in these conversations, and just managing the political fallout of the losers.
I think that's very difficult. And the losers are, the civil service is overstaffed. The public enterprises are way overstaffed. Eskom should probably be a quarter of its size, if not less. And how do you how do you deal with the political troubles that could occur in the event that there's not some sort of payoff to these people? It's very, very difficult. And but reform is always difficult in these circumstances. And presently we are politically stuck on the big reforms. I think one does need leadership. One has to bite the bullet on certain other things. But that's why there are two types of reform on the question of is it best to go for big bang reform where you do a whole lot of things at once, and it sort of politically overwhelms the system and your opposition is taken unawares and it's all just done? Or do you do it gradually, in which case the risks of your reforms being derailed could be greater?
Yeah, and in many ways, we don't have the luxury of time, and we're racing against the ever failing state, as well as, and from the perspective of the ANC, if they want to rescue their political fortunes, they might want to hasten some of these reforms. But as we said earlier, that it seems unlikely that they're going to do that. But I think reform is not like a buffet where you go and just pick the ones that suit you. It's a full 5-course meal, and you have to sign up to the whole reform agenda. You can't just kind of piecemeal your way through it.
And it's also, but if we had extensive reforms in South Africa, addressing the public enterprises, privatizing, taking steps to turning around the energy situation, dealing with the unemployment issues through labor market reform, cutting down the civil service, reducing red tape, and so forth. Well, then you could stand the chance of turning the economy around in 18 months and creating many jobs. But you've got to have faith in that, and faith that these will be the results. And I don't see the government having faith in that. Will it save them? Is the question they'd be asking themselves.
But there is a bigger question about BEE. And here I raise something that really still, after all these years of this, managed to shock me quite a bit, was that President Ramaphosa said in his court papers that cadre deployment is also practiced in the private sector. And this was, in my view, an incredible revelation. He in a section of his court papers, funded again by you and me and other taxpayers, set out a case of what ANC cadre deployment supposedly is. And in the section where he describes the different institutions that are subject to deployment, he explicitly says that leadership positions in the private sector are also discussed and decided at the deployment committee. Now that opens up a whole new kettle of fish, because what we had known in the public domain for many years was the impact on the public sector and the idea that the ANC wanted to capture and control the levers of state. But if we have a situation now, and I'm in the process of probing what the reality is behind Ramaphosa's statement, which he made under oath, by the way, of the private sector actually also being subject to this. So what it conjures with me is the idea that, BEE in combination with some kind of recommendation from the deployment committee leads to a decision of someone who should be heading a bank or a big corporate, or, that's how I can, and I think most reasonable people would interpret what the president said in those court papers. Then we're talking not about state capture, but we're actually talking about country capture here, because that would suggest that even the private sector itself, which in many ways has been surprisingly patient and, willing to cooperate with the ANC in this stitch up of, big business and big government and big labor, perhaps we're looking at a piece of the puzzle that explains why that relationship is so overly cozy in many cases. But like I say, this is something that I'm probing at the moment. We'll get more information out to the public as soon as we can. But I think that is a very important piece of the puzzle if you want to also understand BEE and its links with the ANC and why it is actually elite empowerment more than anything else, this may be a big part of the answer.
Yeah, and the term BE refers to Black economic empowerment, but it's actually Black political empowerment, replacing that E with the P. And I'm not surprised to hear that statement from the president. In many respects, that is what characterized his career as well. It was quite a while ago, the late 90s, but I distinctly remember when he fell out with President Mbeki, the language that was used to describe him was that he's being deployed to the private sector. So, I think there's a lot of continuity there in terms of his own experience politically and in the business world that I think informs that view. I think businesses have been a bit equivocal about criticizing the ANC, even though there's so many manifest failures. Because in many ways their interests are intertwined. There are ANC-aligned politicians on their boards, there are big contracts with the state, and generally a kind of a feeling of not wanting to appear unpatriotic. But actually, I think they would be performing much more of a patriotic duty by standing up against some of these misgovernance problems. So how do you get business to kind of change their attitude?
Well, it's curious because business and the private sector don't work well with government and vice versa. They don't trust each other. Businesses will always go where there's a profit. So sometimes they do hold their nose while they associate themselves with some political parties, and they sort of grin and bear it. But here's something really interesting, and I read the headlines this morning with amazement. There was one headline this morning that says Pravin Gordhan is going to change the Eskom board, and the changes mooted. And I said, well, the best change would be to change Gordhan and get him as far away from Eskom as possible, because he's been there all the time while Eskom's going down the toilet. There have been 8 vacancies on that board for the last 4 years, and they've done nothing about it. The problem is not Eskom. It's the Eskom management and the cadre deployment and the ineptitude of government and the feeding at that Eskom trough by the ANC through Chancellor House and any other number of, and the Guptas, of course, cleaned the cupboard out eventually. But Chancellor House through Hitachi have been bleeding Eskom for a decade or more, solely at the interest of the ANC. So the ANC is the problem, and I believe business are starting to see that. So the only way business will turn their back on the ANC is if they believe that the ANC are going down. And I'm starting to see businesses publicly speaking about the ANC going down. Businesses unfortunately never found a president they don't love. But when they see that the president might be going down, then they can turn their back on the president. And that's what we're waiting for in this country. And then, ironically, isn't it amazing that Cyril Ramaphosa dubbed Zuma's 9 years as 9 wasted years while he sat next to Zuma as his deputy president? And all I've seen in the last 5 years is that 5 wasted years have gone by with Cyril Ramaphosa as the president. So there's no difference. It's exactly the same thing. So until business wakes up and realizes that the ANC is taking this country down a political cul-de-sac and a business cul-de-sac, no foreign direct investments coming into this country, and it won't as long as the electricity doesn't work and that there's no water in major cities and that the roads don't work and our ports don't work, nobody's going to invest in South Africa. So business can actually have a huge influence in changing this government, if they will, and if they can find their backbone to do that.
So Piet, just as we bring this conversation to a close, what we're not saying is that businesses must become isolated. That's not independence. I mean, I suppose what we're really talking about is interdependence. How do people watching this show or listening to it, how do they go about instilling this kind of culture of independence and also working with other like-minded businesses to achieve some of the objectives that we've spoken about today?
It's not a Lone Ranger project. Becoming independent is only possible in cooperation and coordination with others in different forms in civil society. And now we're speaking about the commercial way in which people cooperate. And of course, there is the instance where you can form a business, and it's very organized toward mostly the financial profit motive, and that's all good and well. But if we only organize on that principle as businesses, we may be successful in ensuring a niche profit. We may profit on the way down as South Africa at the back and the downslopes. We may see some businesses doing very, very well. But in the end, there won't be a social order for us to do it all for. What is the end of being successful as a business if you don't want to live in that place anymore, or you don't want to store your wealth there, if there's nothing to fight for or to conserve? And so the independence we speak of at Sakeliga is the independence found in cooperation with others toward a higher duty. In this case, the constitutional duty of businesses to shape the constitutional order such that it provides a flourishing economy, because that's what a flourishing society needs. Independence means making that responsibility your own, having an internal locus of control, and not abdicating that to a government or a state or anybody else.
I hope you enjoyed this special retrospective edition of the Solutions Podcast, and that you came away with a deeper understanding of the role that business could be playing in our ever-changing society. Just some quick housekeeping before I go. I have been appointed as the new Chief Executive of the Free Market Foundation. That role commences on 1 January. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break from podcasting for December, so my last episode will be at the end of November. I'll keep you posted about developments on the show. But in the meantime, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts and feedback. If you're watching on YouTube, please do comment down below about what this show means to you. Do you get value out of the solutions that are discussed on this podcast? And again, if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well. Don't forget to like this video on YouTube. That's it from me for the time being. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until we speak again, take care.